This is episode 129 of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. What is a mandatory reporter? The Nursing Home Abuse Podcast is dedicated to providing news and information for families whose loved ones have been injured in a nursing home. Here are your hosts, Georgia attorneys Rob Schenk and Will Smith. Hello out there and welcome back. My name is Rob Schenk.
And I'm Will Smith.
And we are your hosts for this episode of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. This episode is going to be chock full with exceptional information. We're going to be talking about mandatory reporting, what it is, who are mandatory reporters, and all of that. But we're not going to do that alone. We're going to do that with a guest, an esquire of a guest. And before we get into who this person is, I just want to say that it goes without saying that this podcast, this particular episode of this podcast, is for general information purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice in any way. If you are out there listening or watching and you have specific questions for your specific legal matter, I would highly suggest that you contact an attorney in your local area. And with that, Will, who do we have on this podcast today that is going to be talking about mandatory reporters?
We have Nancy Brent, who is both a registered nurse and an attorney in private law practice in Wilmette, Illinois. She represents nurses and other healthcare providers before the state agency that regulates health professionals. She graduated from Loyola University of Chicago School of Law in 1981, and her experience prior to opening her private practice included a year of insurance defense for a major insurance company and establishing a law firm with two other attorneys. After 3 years of doing defense work at the firm, she decided to establish a private practice in 1986. Brent has published extensively and lectured across the country in the area of law and nursing practice, both of which she is eminently qualified to do. She is a member of several legal and nursing professional associations, including the American Nurses Association, Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing, the Illinois State Bar Association, and the American Association of Nurse Attorneys. So welcome to the show.
Welcome to the show, Nancy.
Well, thank you.
All right. How is the weather up there in Chicago right now? I hear there's another cyclone.
Well, it's in Wilmette, isn't it?
Yes, well, Wilmette is a suburb of Chicago. It's right up north of on the lake. There's Chicago, then Evanston, then Wilmette. And so Chicago usually sometimes gets different weather than we do, but for the most part, if it's lousy in Chicago, it's lousy in Wilmette. So we luckily that big storm that came across the country yesterday and went further north didn't affect us as much as we thought it was going to. So we didn't have much snow thunder and all those kinds of things, and it's a nice day today, but it's still pretty cool. So
great. And so just for the audience isn't thrown for a loop, as of the date today, it's August 19th, but we recorded this way back in April of this year. So so that's why we anyway, because I don't want to, because it might be 89 degrees in
well, I heard
Wilmette
it takes a while for it to get warm up there. My mom's from Decatur, Illinois, and that's all that I'm familiar with. So welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
And
so thank you.
So Nancy, the overarching theme of the show is talking about mandatory reporters, and for most of the public, at least most of the public that I know, they have never heard those words together ever. So can you just give us a 40,000-foot view of what the term mandatory reporter even means?
Yes, well, I'd be happy to at least try to translate it so it makes sense. A mandatory reporter is someone who is listed in a state law that is required to report a particular situation or event to the regulatory agency that manages the particular problem that might come up, such as elder abuse or elder neglect. And so they are mandated by law to report those kinds of observations, information, and if they do so in good faith, There is usually no liability, if you will. There's no criminal liability or any other type of liability, but the person is required to report these observations or concerns in order to help protect individuals who might not be able to report these things themselves.
So, a couple of things with that. So, no liability in terms of they can get in trouble for not reporting. That's the liability component that you're talking about in that aspect, right? Like it's.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
In other words, if they would not report and they are a mandated reporter, let's say, as an example, a nurse, a social worker, a teacher, a psychotherapist, if they did not report and that was discovered, then they may face liability. And converse is important to stress, as maybe I didn't make that quite clear.
Yeah.
If they do report, and they do report in good faith, and that's something that is presumed by the law, they do not face any criminal liability, civil liability, or any potential professional disciplinary liability if they follow through with the mandate and report as they are required to.
Gotcha. And so, and I know that you don't have the entire list in your pocket right now, but what are some of the groups of people, classifications of people that are mandatory reporters, and what are some of the groups of people? You mentioned the elderly, but what are some of the groups of people that are actually the quote unquote victims or the beneficiaries of the reporting? Who are those classifications?
Sure. Okay, well, let's start with the groups first. Of course, anybody who's involved in the medical field would be required to be a mandated reporter. Also, law enforcement are required to report abuse and neglect that they might observe. Social workers, those are may or may not be in the healthcare setting, but social workers, and so these individuals are people who are in a position to potentially discover abuse and neglect because they work with populations that are vulnerable, that are needy, that may not be able to speak, for themselves. And of course, elder abuse and exploitation is one group of people that might be the victims. Others are children, and that's usually defined as someone under the age of 17. Those who are disabled, either physically or mentally, and have difficulty communicating or have to rely on someone to care for them 24/7, and situations may arise, in that kind of situation. So they're vulnerable individuals, and because they may not be able to speak for themselves, or they're afraid to speak for themselves, these mandated reporters are required to do that for them. They're advocating, if you will, for the potential for the victim.
So, if you're a nurse or a doctor and you're examining for whatever reason an elderly person or maybe a child, and you notice suspicious markings or bruising around the genitalia, then you would have a duty to say, "Hey, I think something may be going on here."
That's correct. And let's be clear that obviously sometimes these things are discovered at a moment, and it's not clear whether or not there is actual abuse or neglect going on. But based on information, the questions that might be asked of the individual person who is the potential victim, things don't quite make sense. The parents aren't being very cooperative, or the elder resident family doesn't really want to speak with you about these kinds of things, then you start to have a suspicion about, well, maybe something isn't quite right. So it isn't that you have to have actual knowledge that something has happened. It's that you have to have a reasonable belief or suspicion is another word that is used sometimes, that abuse and or neglect has taken place. And then if that's the case and you can document that carefully and factually and honestly, then that has to be reported to the respective agency where the report is to go.
So that makes sense in terms of what you mentioned, the good faith effort to report, and that goes to the occasion in which maybe the parent, there might be symptoms of abuse, but there's not abuse. There's an innocent explanation, and so that the parent or whoever is the accused cannot retaliate against the actual reporter if the report was done in good faith.
That's correct, and most of these reports are made confidentially. So although the family member may know or think they may know who reported, they're done confidentially, and there can be no retaliation for reporting in good faith. Now, if it's somebody that the person across the street doesn't like the family and so reports without any kind of clear suspicion and good faith suspicion, then of course that's outside the protection of the mandatory reporting statute. Then they could be held liable.
So I feel like some of the audience might say something along the lines of, well, no duh, like why are we having to legislate this? And I think the reason why people don't know that, and I know that it was like one of the first days of tort class in law school, you learned that, at least in the United States, you really don't, unless there's some type of duty by operation of law, you don't have a duty really to help anybody. You can walk past somebody on the side of the road, and you could, even though you could easily help them, you don't have a duty to do that. And actually, that was one of the final Seinfeld episode explored that topic. But anyway,
it's like the lady in New York that's screaming on the sidewalk, the famous case.
Yeah,
nobody does anything.
But can you kind of delve into that a little bit? That component of it, the policy rationale behind why we have to legislate that.
Well, and it makes sense, and it's really a very simple rationale. If one can't speak up for themselves in situations where they are dependent on a family member or a nurse in a long-term care facility or a social worker, and they're concerned about maintaining that relationship, but yet they're scared about what's happening. They don't know who to turn to. They become very, very unsure of what they should be doing. And as a result, they may become depressed. They may withdraw more than they usually would. Their whole focus and their whole being can be radically changed because they can't speak up for themselves or don't think they should. They're worried about the consequences. And as a result, the mandatory reporters are the ones that have to be ever vigilant to the potential for abuse, neglect, sexual exploitation, financial exploitation, so that if in fact it is going on, and that's not for the nurse to say, oh yeah, I know it is, or oh, no, it's not. Once it's reported, it is investigated, and if it's a founded report, then it's taken on through the process, and help is offered and dealt with in relation to the victim. But the nurse shouldn't be going in, or the teacher, or anyone going in and saying, here, let me help you, let's get you out of here. I know where you can stay until we get this resolved. It's the reporting and the actual factual, truthful reporting that is the obligation of the mandatory reporter.
And I think it's you made a very good point, and some people maybe didn't realize this, is that the whole reason for this is to protect the vulnerable, is to protect children, to protect the elderly. If I go to get a physical and the doctor notices, like I mentioned earlier, bruising, around, certain areas of my body, I'm a 41-year-old independent man. They're not going to report that. The idea is that there are those, like you said, that don't have a voice, that need extra protection, and so it seems like that's the impetus behind it.
Yes, and I think it's also interesting, along a similar vein, now when you go into the hospital, even as an outpatient basis, at least for women anyway, they're now required to ask, do you feel safe at home? Mm-hmm. And regardless of the age, okay? So
I'm laughing only because I had a friend, and I know him and his wife very closely, and they she fell down some stairs and broke her nose. And if you know this couple, you know that he's a very meek person. They went to the hospital, and they actually had to. She was telling me about this. They took her aside, and they were like, ma'am, do you feel safe? And she was like, what are you talking about? She's like, I actually fell. I really did this. But yeah, you're right. And she's my age as well, but they did that.
Yeah, and I think I think it's not there's no exception to it. They just ask, and of course I can say yes or no. But if I'm sitting there and I have bruises and so forth, then someone who is able to make a better assessment needs to follow through with that. But I think we're becoming aware that there's a lot that goes on in the world that people are vulnerable, whether whether they have a mental health problem or a physical problem or is disabled or just meek and by themselves and depend on other people to take care of them. And that can be, very problematic if you're exploited or abused or neglected. You keep quiet because you don't want to change the format.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Can you talk about where mandatory reporting exists in terms of is it federal law? Is this something that each state has? Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, it's I think the real immediate area is the state laws. They have all states have adult protection services. All states have child abuse and neglect reporting acts, elder abuse acts. And so it's really on the state level. There are some federal laws, but the state laws mimic those. And so it would be the state agency or the state level where these complaints would be reported, and then taken on the state level.
And at least in your experience and your understanding of the law as it is maybe in Illinois, what are some of the typical signs, physical outward signs, not if somebody says please help me, but the physical outward signs of someone would have that would invoke the mandatory reporting of for a nurse or a doctor or whoever it is?
Okay, well, I think any kind of consistent bruising, for example, black eyes all the time, or broken bones. Oh yes, I fell. Well, isn't this the third time? Well, yeah, I'm kind of clumsy. Well, you might want to start thinking about that kind of thing. I also think when people are not eating, let's say they have been eating fairly well, and you have a resident in a nursing home and likes to be involved in the activities and so forth, and then all of a sudden doesn't, gets withdrawn. That's another problem. Unexplained bleeding from a body part, particularly like the vagina or the anus, would be another problem that one would start to worry about what might be going on with that resident or that child sexually. And also financial exploitation is another concern, and you don't necessarily see physical presence of that, but what you'll see is maybe the resident or the individual saying, look, I don't really want to see Fred again this week. He was here last week. I had to sign several documents. I don't want to see him again. So these are all, it's the overall picture of the individual, and it may be a physical problem, or it may be more of a behavioral issue. Another concern for residents in long-term care facilities are decubiti, because they should not have them to begin with. I mean, they're difficult to prevent, but if you have a good regime of turning and changing and so forth, there should not be an excessive amount of decubiti in a patient who's either bedridden or even who has to sit in a wheelchair for most of the day.
It's interesting that you bring up the financial part, because we actually just spoke with somebody yesterday, and this is Georgia, but he heads he's involved in the what's called the North Georgia Elder Abuse and Exploitation Task Force.
Yeah, that was Joe Gavalis. We had him on episode 126.
And he was discussing the move to have banks essentially become mandatory reporters in certain ways when they notice certain financial transactions that are sketchy. So if grandma all of a sudden, depletes takes all of her life savings out, they're going to potentially report that to somebody.
Well, that's interesting because I don't think, and I think that would be a good idea. Currently, I do not believe that banks have that responsibility. They're one of the exceptions.
Yeah.
But I think, that individual banker would have the overall picture of what's going on with this person's account. Just like, for example, I couldn't find my new checks that were sent one time to the office. They didn't come. They must have been misdelivered. So I called my personal banker, and she was on the lookout for them. And luckily, a friendly neighbor who they'd been misdelivered to got them to me, and that was fine, and it worked out okay. But she knew that she had to watch my account and had put a security thing on it and so forth. So they're in a very important position to be able to eyeball financial exploitation, because it happens probably more than even some of the others do.
Oh, it does. It's a huge problem.
Nancy, so with regard to, let's say, a nurse, for example, and there is a senior citizen or a female or a child or whatever the case may be, where there's not necessarily physical symptoms, but as you mentioned, emotional symptoms, the emotional withdrawal, the depression or whatever. I feel like that puts that nurse in a very difficult position. In terms of having to judge that situation. In representing nurses in that capacity, what are some of the issues that arise in making that call of is this triggered under the report? Is this like, if there's any doubt, report it, this type of thing? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is when a nurse does observe more behavioral kinds of concerns, to share that with his or her nurse manager or supervisor, whatever the term may be, to determine if perhaps, rather than an immediate reporting, an assessment need be done by a psychiatrist or a psychologist or, a social worker, whomever might be involved in doing that, to see if further information can be obtained. Again, the nurse isn't the investigator, but on the other hand, she doesn't want to, or he doesn't want to be willy-nilly. Yeah, I'm going to report this because I think this is a problem. It just might have been a bad day or whatever. But the fact that he or she observed it and knows the patient, it needs to be taken to another level of assessment, and then a determination made. And I might add here on this, because when you start sharing that kind of information, let's say the nurse manager may say, well, we don't care what it is. We can't have any reporting coming out of this hospital that there's been a child that has been abused or neglected, or that's my neighbor's kid. We're not going to do that. You can have liability, again, for not reporting when that reporting is blocked by someone else. In other words, the nurse manager would be in trouble there, and the nurse herself might be in trouble. She would have to do an end run around the nurse manager because no one can obstruct you from making a report that you believe in good faith needs to be made.
That's actually, that brings up an important point, Nancy. What are the liabilities for failure to report when it should have been done? Is it criminal liability? Is it civil liability? Are you open to lawsuits from the victim's family? How does that work?
Okay, well, if you have a statutory mandated reporting, the statute would, or the law would tell you what your liabilities would be if you did not. And usually it's a misdemeanor, and that's a criminal matter, meaning that it's either 1 year in jail or $1,000 fine or a combination thereof. So that's a criminal side. The civil side, it's interesting that if there is no specific penalty in the statute, or there is no statute about mandatory reporting, you can sue civilly under a negligence theory in that you knew or should have known that this was abuse or neglect, and therefore, if you are found that you breached your duty of reporting in that situation, then you would be liable for any kinds of costs or damages that the victim would have suffered. And then, if you have a license or are certified, such as a certified nurse assistant or a registered nurse or a physician, failure to report also is included in professional licensure statutes, so that they might lose their license or be disciplined by the state board that regulates their practice.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Well, Nancy, are there any issues that are on the that are new to mandatory reporting and liability for failure reporters, or anything that's kind of that you're seeing more and more?
Not really. I still have nurses who call me and say, I'm not sure about this, and what should I do? So one of the things I think that is important for someone to think about who is a mandated reporter is to seek legal advice. If they are concerned about whether or not, they're doing so in good faith, or they're not sure if this is really a sign or a symptom of abuse that's been going on for a long time, but what about this or that? I think that it's important to point out, and it continues to be the case in my practice, that if there is a concern, the nurse seeks advice as to how do I handle this, what do you think, what should we do, and then we balance it and decide whether or not there should be a report or not. And usually I will caution anyone who speaks with me to err on the side of if in fact they are, they have this good faith suspicion, and we've looked over what observations and behavior and so forth has been seen by the health professional. So that's, I think, one new thing, and to emphasize is that if someone's not sure, get some input. Go to your resources or go to risk management if you're uncomfortable about talking with an attorney. But someone should help you make the determination, but cannot block you from doing so. And so sometimes maybe it's better to have a personal attorney who, again, is not involved in the system in which one works or whatever, to help with that determination.
And I would imagine that you're very uniquely qualified doing that, having both a JD and an RN.
Well, I'd like to think I'm really unique, yes. But I think I understand, what nursing is all about. Not every single aspect of it. Many times my clients have to, update me on what's been going on, because I've been practicing law for some time and practiced nursing a long time ago. But I think that professionals who have these concerns like to speak to an attorney who knows their profession. So whether it be a physician lawyer or a nurse lawyer or a social worker attorney, those are good places to start to get input, because they don't have to explain the nursing practice. However, I will say that there are many attorneys who are not health care, don't have a healthcare background, that know very much about these kinds of things as well. But yes, but thank you. I try to combine the two as best I can, and have been doing that, for many, many years now.
Well, speaking of that, Nancy, what is a good way for somebody that's a nurse or a doctor or a mandatory reporter that's in the state of Illinois? How would they get a hold of you?
Well, probably the easiest way, I do a number of columns online, and the Brent law at nurse.com is a good place to send in questions or concerns. I don't always get a chance to answer all of them, and I do put them on the blog as opposed to independently talking with the person. But in my office, of course, I'm listed in the phone book if they have a personal concern that they, want to deal with. But those are two options that people could call in if they wanted.
And I would suggest people, and we're going to put your contact information up there, but
the Brent Law email address we'll put up there.
But I would suggest people go to this blog too, because it's very possible that somebody has asked that question before, that somebody's experienced the same thing.
Well, that's right, and sometimes just looking online, punching in the search bar, blogs on mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect, you'll get a lot of information, and mine will come up there because I've done a number of them over the years.
There you go. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. This is an area that we get a lot of questions about, so we were glad that you were able to answer our questions.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to have done so, and I wish both of you good luck in your continued podcast, and I'll look forward to hearing this one.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay.
A lot of great stuff. Nancy, one of the few attorneys that we've had on the show. We've had maybe a handful. We had Iris Gonzalez from the AARP Foundation.
Richard Mollett.
Eric Carlson.
Melanie McNeil.
Okay, so she's one of dozens and dozens, a majority of ours.
She is the only
nurse attorney,
and that's very impressive that she is not only has a nursing degree but a Juris Doctorate as well.
That's right,
and I imagine that comes in very handy.
A lot of education.
Yes.
Something that I wanted to bring up is that this Wednesday is a holiday called Senior Citizens Day. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously is a nursing home podcast that's very near and dear to us. So get out there, visit your local nursing homes, call your grandparents.
Yeah.
Depending how old you are, call your parents. But show some appreciation, take some Krispy Kreme donuts to a nursing home. Spread some love on this Wednesday, which is Senior Citizens Day, August 21st.
Absolutely.
All right. That will conclude this particular episode of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. You can catch new episodes of the podcast every other week on Monday morning. Every other Monday morning, I should say. Every other Monday morning. You can catch a new episode of
Twice a month.
Twice a month. Bi-monthly. Mm-hmm. Yes. On our website, which is nursinghomeabusepodcast.com, or on YouTube, or you can check us out wherever you get your podcasts from: Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Apple Casts, Pod Puppies, Apple Puppies, wherever you get them. Mm-hmm. And with that, we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. Nothing said in this podcast, either by the host or the guest, should be construed as legal advice, nor is intended to create an attorney-client relationship between the host or their guest and the listener. New episodes are available every Monday on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app, as well as on YouTube and our website, nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. Again, that's nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. See you next time.